All right, hi, Richard Moore here from 8-Step Startup. I hope you're well. So I wanted to talk about essentially how to read effectively. I got a question this morning from a guy who's asked me the question that I suppose has brought this on, so it makes sense to tackle it directly and help out a bit. So he's asked me, how do you make the decision whether to read a book cover to cover or skim and move on? Okay, and he says, I feel I'm overcommitted to reading too many books cover to cover. Aren't we all? The problem is there's too many books out there to read all in one day. Okay, so that's where you need to look at it. With that in mind, you need to be thinking, right, well, what do I actually decide to read and what do I decide not to read? One thing I've mentioned in the past, if you think about reading, it should be the same as many things. If you're focusing on, for instance, with your business, real estate, then you should be reading things around that subject as opposed to dipping all over the place. And that's why it gets me a bit irritated when you get someone who works in, I don't know, something completely far removed from investing, and then they're there reading The Intelligent Investor. What's the point? It's of no value for what you're focusing on right now. It could be of later value, but that's an advanced book for investors. Why would you bother reading it? So there's not enough time to do it. But just to explain in reading, I've been asked a lot about how I do it, how I structure it. It's not rocket science. It's actually quite simple what I do. I read 3 times a day. Okay, once I read first thing, second I read around around lunchtime, and then thirdly before bed, basically. Okay, kind of around lunchtime or just after. Okay, after lunch, because after lunch I read and then have a little bit of a break, a little bit of a rest. So this is about 15 minutes. So is this. And this is about, by bedtime, it's about 30 minutes. So the thing to remember when it comes to this is that there should be an objective when you're reading, okay? So the objective always, when I'm dipping into books for skimming, let's call it, let me rewrite that. The objective for skimming, if I'm going to skim, is as follows. I want to get one nugget of info. Just one. That's my mission. And the thing will often go, well, the thing is, that's, you know, how can you then get the most of a book? If I'm going to be dipping into a book 3 times a day, every single day, then across the passage of time, I actually get into quite a few books. And it means that ones that are showing me something of value, I can dip into quite regularly. Cover to cover is obvious, you know, you read the whole thing. But I'm going to explain today 4 different types of book and how I would read those. Okay, so let's start with biographies. Okay, it's really simple. A biography you need to read cover to cover for the first read. You know, this is my opinion, okay? My opinion is you should read it cover to cover simply because you need to get the background and understand the context for the anecdotes and the stories. This is a bit of indulgence, but it's important. You know, if I'm going to read about Jeff Bezos or Richard Branson or whoever, I want to have the background and the context behind the things I'm reading about to really have a feel of how they've actually grown to the position they're in. So those biographies are things that I typically read before bed. Okay, because then I can spend a bit more time with it and get a big chunk of it out during the day. In addition, there of course are the kind of, I suppose, method books. Some people call it a how-to. Just a word on this, by the way. Be really selective. You don't have much time in the day, okay? And if you're going to read a how-to book, be really careful who you pick, because plenty of people will be writing how-to books that are relevant to your space, but only a few are selling multi-millions in terms of the actual amount of units sold. Go to the ones that have been seminal works, that have moved through the passage of time and people keep going back to them and reading them. You know what I'm talking about. There are a lot of books that are just being released or being released for a while and no one's heard of it because it's just the same old trough feeding kind of author. Make sure because there's not much time, make sure you focus on books that, you know, have been proven to be of value, at least to start with. Then you can become a bit more discerning and pick things out, but cover all the main books that have been read. You know, for instance, How to Make Friends and Influence People is a book that's been read for decades, so why would you not make use of that if that's relevant to your space, of course. Okay, with these books, these are ones I definitely skim. Okay, I definitely skim them, because typically what you have with a book like this is a couple of key theses or nuggets of information, okay, but what you'll find is that they are padded out with anecdotal text to give you examples of real world kind of instances of these particular theses happening. So with that in mind, you want to go in with this kind of challenge, and this is how these 15 minutes work. I would say I go in for, say, 15 minutes, and I have this objective, as I said here, this objective. I need to find one nugget of information. I would flick through the book, have a look, how long is one chapter? Maybe a chapter's, say, I don't know, 8 or 9 pages, no problem, let's go for it. I've got 15 minutes, and, you know, working at pace. You know, pretty frantic, like you're on a bit of a mission, taking notes as you go, just one word notes on paragraph. If you could summarize a paragraph in one word, do it in the side by the side of the text. And then you want to get to that end of that chapter and say, right, in a sentence, in say 6 words, what is that about? Could I take one thing? Then that's done. Simple. Then that's done. Okay, so you're going in and out, and it's a very active way of reading. It has to be, because if you're just sitting there, you know, pinging through each page and reading the whole thing, it's taking you too long to often get to the actual nugget of information. So not only are you not reading it cover to cover, you're not even reading a full chapter. You're just literally skimming through, you know, what's the general gist of this paragraph? Is it kind of backing up a bit more information? Well, then move on, go to the next bit. I'm looking for something that's going to just be a piece of information that author's trying to get to me, okay? Everything else is fluff, okay? And you want to kill the fluff. Don't read that stuff. You get used to it after. It's like, oh, this bit's a bit of a story. And yeah, it might be that I'm missing the feel of the book, but what I'm going to be doing is dipping back into that book again and again. So with these kind of books, I read them multiple times, so multiple reads, often of the same chapter. If I grab a chapter and a book's been quite good in delivering a piece of information, I'll make a point of dipping in again. Maybe I've done it in the morning, maybe I'll dip in again to the same book that day after lunch. But I do it quite a few times. And the idea is if I keep dipping into the book, then I'll find a bit of information each time, okay? If I'm not getting much, maybe shelve it and go to something else, because it's almost like you're constantly aware that time is of the essence, and so you've got to get the most from it you can. Just quickly then, moving on, as well as these types of books, we also have, of course, fiction and stories, okay? Personally, I'm inclined to not really bother that much with stories, because I just don't. That's just not my thing. And I remember, it's interesting that a lot of people know me now for being quite an avid reader, and every day with this structure I read, or at least dip into books very, very regularly. It's a very ironic thing, because many years ago I was known as the slow reader that never read anything, and I would maybe read a couple of books in a year, and that was it. Okay, I never did it. And the reason why was simple. I felt I should be reading fiction. I felt I should. So there are a lot of classical fiction stories and things like that, ones that people are that are well known to people, and I felt I should have read them. Everything from Shakespeare to Dickens and everything in between. I felt like I was like, oh well, I need to read this because everyone else has read it. So I would drag myself through these stories, and for some reason, for me, I just couldn't connect with it, and I didn't kind of get reading. And because I didn't read that much, because I didn't necessarily enjoy reading stories, the result was I wasn't practiced, so I was a slow reader, which perpetuated the whole thing. When now was the opposite, because I really see value in reading, especially these kind of method books that are going to help me with maybe reading about how business is being grown or something, because then I can use it for Startup Business TV or for the consulting I do. There's a real value in reading this stuff. As a result, it means I'm more practiced because I'm reading quite regularly, and because I'm more practiced, it means, of course, that I get more into stories. Than if I was to read a story, then I'd be quite good at it. But story, of course, you'd need to read cover to cover. I would say, personally, I don't read them at all, okay? It's very rare, maybe a couple of stories a year, but in the main, I'm focused on other things. But this feeds into this last category. I want to make sure I can fit it on the screen. So audio. Audiobooks are massively underrated, okay? The question I was asked earlier, which is the whole point of this, I mean, you've just put in a mention, the stream wasn't expected. Yeah, I just thought I'd hop online because I got a question that came up. So the question that was asked earlier was, how do you make the decision whether to read a book cover to cover or skim and move on? Okay, because this person is I'm just reading it off my screen, is overcommitted to reading too many books cover to cover. With audiobooks, you get a number of benefits. Firstly, it's someone else reading it, and it doesn't mean you can do something else. You can't go work on a report or focus on something and have an audiobook in the background and expect to take it in, okay? That's why I don't play music when I'm working, okay? Because let's just take a step back. Multitasking is massively overrated. Good news for all you gents out there. It's massively overrated because you are not putting your entire brain's bandwidth on delivering a task, on a task really effectively. Do one task at a time really well. And that goes as far as meaning don't focus on listening to music while you're reading a book, because part of your brain's taking music. Don't have an audiobook playing in the background while you're doing some work, for instance. You may think it's a clever way of doing things, but you're not taking the book and you won't focus on the work. Believe me, I've tried this, I've tested an experiment, it just doesn't seem to work. You're more effectively doing one thing or the other. With audiobooks, if we look at the some real benefits, firstly, it's read in can you even read that if I change the pen? It's read in 4 to 8 hours usually, which means you can hear it on a commute, or in the car, or when you're walking, okay? Even better, they're usually narrated, okay, by the author. You see that? You can. It's narrated by the author. So for instance, recently I got a hold of Tribes by Seth Godin because I wanted to dip into it again, but I got the audiobook this time. And having Seth Godin read it, it's fantastic because then I get all of his inflection. If that person wrote the book, then their ideas and the kind of their emphasis will be in the right place. So you get it delivered in the way it should be. In addition to that, typically what I find, especially with these types of books, is that narrators like to go off piste. Gary Vaynerchuk's a great example. For every line that's in a book that he reads in an audiobook, you get another 3 lines of him saying, I'm going to go off script, let me add this to it. And the thing is, if he wrote a book a couple of years ago, then he did the audiobook afterwards, you end up with more views on things that he's put in, he's thought about over time. So it gets so much more done that way. But more importantly, when you don't have the time to read a method book cover to cover, by method and how to, I include with that things like Tribes, like by Seth Godin. That's a book that was seminal. I really wanted to make sure I read the whole thing cover to cover, but with this structure, 15 minutes in the morning, 15 after lunch, 15 half an hour at the end of the day, I couldn't sanction that kind of time. So an audiobook was a great way of nailing that whole book and getting that information into my head. And I always listen to audiobooks twice in a row. Okay, so there's a really good tip or technique. Listen to the audiobook, then go straight back through it again. After listening to an audiobook, you usually have so many great ideas in your head, and the second listening consolidates it so much. And it's brilliant when you get to this point halfway through that second listening when you're like, I remember this stuff, yeah, that's all clear. Almost not like you're bored of it, but you're just like, I've got this, I get the thesis now. It really, really consolidates, okay? So make sure you listen to it twice. And if you're desperate to read fiction, because it is so time consuming, get the audiobook, go listen to it, you know, whilst you're doing something else. So a lot of people then ask, so if you're listening to audiobooks, what happens to things like music? You know, do you ever listen to music if you are walking in a car, commuting, and always on an audiobook? Do you ever hear any music, especially if when you're working, you don't have it on in the background? Well, here's how I use music, just as an aside. So music's something special. We all agree. Music's an amazing thing to hear, especially your favourite tunes, whatever it is. You know, I'm not going to say what I listen to because it might not be so great. But the music I listen to is done in a functional way. Okay, this might sound like, what kind of world is this guy living in? But seriously, this is something to try. If you haven't tried something, then you can't have a judgment on it. Okay, so with music, I found that when I listened to music, I would get dragged in and I would just so focus on it, and I would end up listening to music for ages. A bit like sometimes how it can be if you're on YouTube or Wikipedia. You know, you get sucked in, then it's the next tune, then it's the next tune. I assign a tune to a task. Okay? So for instance, this morning I closed a sale, okay? So it was a few $1,000s, and I thought, brilliant, that's a great close. If I do sales each day, then why don't I assign a reward to it? So what I'm doing is giving myself a reward in the form of music. So when I got this, I had 2 rewards for this sale, because I thought if it comes in, I'll give myself 2 rewards. And the 2 rewards were, it was listen to music, so 1 tune, and a special type of coffee that one of the companies, if you're interested, I'm really into very nice high-end coffee, and one of my clients really kindly sent me some new coffee. It's a single bean over from Mexico. So I told myself, if you get that deal in, if you close it this morning, you can listen to 1 tune of your choosing, and you can you can make up some of that coffee. What's interesting then is the music gets associated with reward, okay? And if it's associated with reward, then it becomes associated with being successful, completion of a task, okay? So it might not be that you close a deal, but it might be that something like, you know, I've done my reports to the day, or something like that, okay? Yeah, exactly. So yeah, exactly, that's what I'm doing. I'm just reading the comments. So what's a good idea is to think yourself, what music do I want to listen to today? Right, you only get to listen to it. This is pretty punitive on yourself sometimes, but I only get to listen to it if I've earned the right to listen to it. And this is something I was teaching last week when I was with a team in London. I had these people who, they would kick off their day at 9 o'clock, this sales team. By 9:30, some of them are getting coffees. Oh, I've got to have my mid-morning coffee. And I think it's not even mid-morning yet. You're just going off for a cup of tea or coffee just to kind of break up your day. Earn the right, seriously. Get out of bed and work. And if you then achieve something that's got a task reward kind of attached to it, then go and have your break, your coffee, listen to a tune or something like that, then get back on with it. And what it means is all the stuff that you like doing, maybe eating something in particular, having a coffee in my case, a particular type of coffee or whatever it might be, doing all of that, let's get rid of this notification. Doing all of that means that you're enjoying those things that you enjoy anyway, but you're being productive as you go along. So that's taken me a little bit off piece, but you could attach these rewards to completing an audiobook, for instance, or listening to, reading a particular chapter and finding a nugget. You know, if I read 1 chapter of 15 pages in 15 minutes and I get 1 nugget from it, that's a job well done. Task complete. Give myself a reward. Now I can listen to a tune which is 3 minutes long, move on to the next thing. Again, people might think, blimey, this is a really kind of, hard world you're creating. In fact, no, it's associating work with pleasure, and the fun tasks I set myself to do in the day are then attached to rewards. It's a wonderful way of doing things. So I hope that's clear. Just to run through, and then to answer the question, how do I make the decision whether to read a book cover to cover or skim and move on? Biographies I read cover to cover. Once I've read them cover to cover, I then know where to skim. Okay, so what it means is if I've read a biography, I remember doing this recently with Michael Jordan, and I think I've also got up there, yeah, it's Total Recall, Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'd read them cover to cover, so then I can dip in and go, I know if I go to this chapter I get this, if I go to that chapter I get that, whatever it might be. So you can then dip into them again. So there's both in fact for that, but the first one you have to do cover to cover, and that's the only book I do that with. Method or how-to kind of ones with books on marketing, books on being better at sales, whatever it might be. I skim them. I have 15 minutes. I've got to read a chapter. I've got to find one piece of information, shelve the book, move on. If the book's delivering, next time I get to my reading after lunch, then I do it again. Okay. Fiction and stories, I just don't read them. I just don't anymore. So I might be missing out, but I feel like this is more my space and my world right now. Okay. And arguably, you get a lot of great fiction within these things anyway. Certainly in biographies, they're often great stories. And personally, if you read the right kind of biographies, they're so compelling. I mean, I've banged on about it a lot, but I've read The Shoe Dog, the biography by Phil Knight, who created Nike. And that's an amazing story. It just happens to be non-fictional, arguably non-fictional. So I leave the fictionals altogether, but I'm big on audiobooks. I literally, whenever I'm in my car, because when I teach Taekwondo twice a week or when I'm going to the gym, I have the audiobook is on my phone and it just syncs to the car and I'm just listening to that as I go. So I get through things. But whenever I've listened to an audiobook, I listen to the same one again before I move on to the next one. Let's just see if there's any questions in here. There's a couple of things some people have been writing. So what about alpha ways, Richard? Yeah, it's a really interesting point, Toysin, about the idea of getting into reading, and kind of what I mean by this is after reading for some time it affects you in a certain way. I strongly believe this is a practiced, habitual way of reading. Okay, it wasn't easy to start with. It wasn't like the first time I did it I opened a book and I was getting information. I was terrible. I would read 15 minutes and like that was pointless. I didn't get anything from it. But like with anything, as I've been asked so many times in the past, the number one thing to being successful in anything is consistency. Okay, if you're being consistent, as in every day, you're sticking to your agenda, you can't fail. You literally always get there in the end, but consistency is crucial. Eventually you get to a point where you take in the information you need to, and you feel like you're not wasting so much time. Okay, I mean, with audiobooks, when the author's delivering it, they tend to add more. You're absolutely right, exactly what I was saying. So Grant Cardone, I think I remember a while back, it was last year, when I listened to the 10x rule. Brilliant. You know, he reads the book, but you've got the method of delivery is fantastic because you've got someone who's evangelizing about their own thesis that they've written. But in addition, of course, they'll keep saying, now I'm going to add something here. You should look at it this way as well. So they'll add more stories and things. It's a fantastic way of looking at it. Anything else? Anna is asking, what do I listen to? You mean music, don't you? I'm not going to say. Why not? Because then I'll tell you what, you can guess. You can try and guess, and we'll see where we go from there. Maybe I'll add an incentive to it at some point. Shoe Dog's good book, yeah. And so this is a simple approach. I just wanted to hop online to answer that question. I decide to read a book cover to cover or skimming it based on the type of book it is. It may be that I dip into a book much more frequently, a particular book, than another one, based on something in particular. So if I'm learning about a certain field or certain area, then I'm going to dip into that book or books like that even more around the time when I need to know that information. In addition, for instance, when I'm learning about a particular business ahead of doing a Startup Business TV episode, then of course I read more about that. And I may even, a bit like a biography, I would treat the book that associates with the company a bit more like a biography. I wouldn't go cover to cover, but I would be a little bit more intensive with my reading. Okay, this, by the way, is a really good approach. This first thing of the day, basically this first order of the day is always to read 15 minutes. So I get into my office and I will read for 15 minutes before I do anything. Before I plan my day, the day before I've already decided what book I have to read for the morning. So I will walk into the office and on my desk will be that book ready for the morning. Okay, so I've had my breakfast, I'll walk straight in, pick up the book, and I can then read the whatever chapter I've assigned myself. And it's about waking up your brain and getting it moving. And I find that if I'm looking for one nugget of piece of information, what I've done is basically the first task of the day, I've created a success for myself. It doesn't mean I then go off and, you know, celebrate with a reward of some kind, because I feel that's a little too early in the day to do that. But that's what I do to begin with. This second one, I attach this because seriously, I'm working quite a long hours each day. I have a little nap after lunch, not like some old dude, literally 10 minutes though, that's all. So I have my lunch, then I read for 15 minutes, then I have 10 minutes just to chill, like doze for a bit, and then it just gives me a power nap. I did this like almost 20 years ago. I started doing this. I remember when I was revising for exams, when I was at university as well, I worked my butts off. I was, you know, I really made the point of trying to work as much as possible and do other things as well. And I was often trying to sell and things like that. So I would always have a kind of a power nap in the middle of the day, and it really made the difference. So if you're not trying it, you should. And then at bedtime, I've got 30 minutes. It's a great way of winding down, helping myself then get to sleep. But be sensible. If you're going to do a how-to method book just before bed, you will find then your mind starts getting active. All of your brain's going to start firing, going, I could do this, I could do this, oh, I could do this with the business. And the thing is, I've done it, I've tried it. You can't get any sleep then. You just want to drop everything and go and crack on with some work, which is very noble. But when it's already, like last night, it was about 2 in the morning when I got to sleep, and the last thing I want to do is get myself pumped up about some things I could do with my job. So go easy, maybe stick on the biographies or something like that. But this here, I would say over and above, this method is the game changer. And the irony is, okay, way back many years ago, I was never known as a reader. I was a slow reader and I barely tackled books ever. I would say I probably read a couple of fiction stories a year, and that was it. And I certainly didn't read anything else. I didn't read unless I had to, so schoolwork. And the fictional stories were being read because I felt I should. You know, someone would say, well, you should be reading. How can you not have read Great Expectations? Oh my God, I probably should read that then. And the irony is, it was almost like a joke. I just never read anything, and people would look at me and like, you're so slow. How have you not read more than a page yet if we were in school and things like that? But it's because I wasn't reading for me. I was reading because I felt I should. And when you skip forward to when I started reading for a function or a reason, something built into a decision I made about my life that I wanted to read in a certain way to then help my business or something like that, suddenly there's great reward in doing it because, of course, I can learn more. And, you know, the irony of not reading much in the past is that I actually was big on reading later on, because actually I love to learn stuff. So it was a really good way of looking at it, is that when I assigned myself the task of reading because I knew it would help my business, it suddenly became something I really wanted to start doing more. And so whilst I still don't read fiction stories and things like that, I now am much more active with reading because simply there's a really good reason to do it, I suppose. So that's just the detail. I hope that answered that question for the chap who sent me the question in. And yeah, I'll hop online a bit more every so often. I was unable to do the startup business Q&A yesterday, and on Thursday this week, regrettably won't be able to do the sales Q&A, but it's 1 week. We'll be back in next week, no problem. And I'll try, when I get a chance, to just, you know, jump in and answer some questions this way. It's a bit more fun that way. Thanks very much for watching, and yeah, I'll catch up with you soon. Hope that helps.